It began quietly, without warning, the kind of beginning no one notices until much later, when every moment is replayed in hindsight with unbearable clarity. He was 20 years old, carrying himself with the unsteady confidence of someone caught between youth and manhood. She was 35, her life already marked by years of responsibility, of choices made and burdens carried. Their paths should have remained parallel, separate lines never crossing. Yet life has a way of bending lines, of drawing two people closer in ways no one could predict or prepare for. The first spark was nothing more than a conversation that should have meant nothing. He was visiting the house often, laughing easily with those around him, his presence so natural it never seemed out of place. She watched him from the corner of her eye, amused by his sharp wit, his unpolished honesty. There was something about the way he spoke, as though the world was still wide open to him, unscarred by the disappointments she had learned to carry. When their eyes met, it was brief, innocent in appearance, but beneath it lingered something unspoken, something that felt dangerous in its simplicity. He noticed the way she carried herself, the quiet strength in her posture, the weariness in her smile that did not dim her beauty, but deepened it. He had seen women his age, bright and restless, but she was different, composed, knowing, her presence commanding without effort. At first he told himself it was admiration, respect for someone older, someone who seemed to stand above the chaos of his own uncertain world. But admiration has a way of shifting, of burning hotter than it should, until it no longer feels like respect, but something far more consuming. The moments stretched longer each time. A hand brushing too close as a glass was passed, a conversation that went past midnight while the others slept, the laughter that came too freely when the two of them spoke. She told herself it was harmless, that nothing would come of it, that he was young and she was older, and the lines between them were thick and unbreakable. Yet every time he smiled at her, every time he leaned in just a little closer than necessary, she felt that line weaken, as if desire itself were erasing it one breath at a time. In the beginning, it was only silence that carried the truth. They said nothing aloud, but silence has its own language. It lingers in the pauses, in the spaces between words, in the long-held gaze that dares not break. The silence between them was alive, pulsing with an energy neither of them wanted to acknowledge. He would find excuses to be near her, to ask questions whose answers he already knew, just to hear her speak. She would pretend not to notice, but her heart quickened all the same, betraying her even when her lips did not. The danger of desire is that it grows in the smallest of places. It does not need an open field. It finds its way through cracks, through narrow passages, through the briefest moments when no one else is looking. He began to dream of her at night, the image of her face etched into his thoughts in ways he could not shake. She began to catch herself thinking of him while she worked, while she moved through the rooms of her home, her mind betraying her with a warmth she tried to smother. Both told themselves it was nothing, but both knew it was already something. What made it unbearable was not the distance between their ages, nor the risks that surrounded them, but the sweetness of how it felt when they were near each other. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic confession, only a quiet understanding that passed between them, wordless and undeniable. He would linger when he should have left. She would smile when she should have looked away. The longer it went on, the harder it became to believe that they could return to what they were before. One evening, when the air outside was heavy with the scent of rain, he found himself alone with her in the dimly lit kitchen. The world beyond the walls was silent, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a shroud. She stood at the counter, her hands busy with something small, insignificant, and he stepped closer than he ever had before. The moment was fragile, trembling as though the air itself might break beneath the weight of it. She turned to face him, and in that second, their eyes met with a force that neither could deny. Nothing was spoken, but everything was understood. His breath caught in his throat, her pulse raced in her wrist. It was the moment they both knew, without words, without touch, that they had crossed into something they could never step back from. They did not kiss, they did not touch, but the silence screamed louder than any confession could have. The spark had caught, and though it was still small, still hidden, it burned with a heat that would only grow stronger. As he left that night, the rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like fingers reminding them of the world outside. He walked away with a storm in his chest, his mind restless with thoughts he could not silence. She stood in the quiet house, her heart pounding with a rhythm that felt like betrayal, even though nothing had yet been done. Both knew the truth. They had stepped into a shadow that would only deepen. And once the shadow claims you, it does not easily let go. The spark had been struck. It was no longer a question of if it would burn, but when. And with each passing moment, with each glance, each word, the fire waited, hungry, patient, inevitable. Once a spark is lit, silence becomes a cage. It presses down from every side, holding in the fire that wants nothing more than to break free. For them, silence was both a shield and a weapon. It hid what should not be seen, but it also cut into them with a sharpness that grew unbearable the longer it stretched. The weight of what they carried became heavier with each stolen glance, each moment of closeness that passed unspoken, each night spent thinking of what they dared not say aloud. He felt it most in the stillness after he left her presence. In his small room, lying awake in the dark, the silence pressed against him like a hand around his throat. He wanted to speak her name, to let the word roll off his tongue like a secret prayer, but he knew that even the empty walls could betray him. Instead, he would close his eyes and hear her voice, softer than the night air, weaving its way through his thoughts until sleep would no longer come. The more he tried to quiet his mind, the louder it became. For her, the silence crept into the daylight hours. It followed her into the rooms where family gathered, where conversations hummed around her like bees. She could hear the sound of her own laughter, but it rang hollow, as though a part of her was elsewhere. Every ordinary act felt weighted by the knowledge of what lived in her heart, a secret she could not name. When she stood at the window and watched the young man arrive again, her pulse betrayed her, quickening with a rhythm she tried desperately to hide. She told herself it was nothing more than curiosity, but deep down she knew it was hunger. The weight of silence was not only internal. It lingered in their meetings, wrapping itself around every word, demanding they be cautious. When they spoke, it was always in half measures, their sentences careful, layered with meaning invisible to those around them. A simple question about the day became something else entirely when spoken in the privacy of their shared gaze. A smile lasted a second too long, a hand brushed too close to be dismissed as accident. The silence between their words was filled with everything they dared not admit. They began to carve out moments of secrecy, slivers of time stolen from the day. A walk to the edge of the property, a conversation shared while others slept, a pause in a hallway that stretched into eternity. These moments were brief, fragile, but they became the lifeline of their desire. Each encounter carried its own risk, and yet each risk only deepened the need to return to it. The silence became the language of their longing, and every wordless second was a confession more powerful than speech. But silence is heavy, and weight has its limits. The strain of carrying what they felt began to show in the smallest of ways. His laughter grew tighter, less free, as though every sound he made was forced through a barrier. Her smile trembled at its edges, revealing cracks that no one else seemed to notice. Around others, they performed their roles with precision, but beneath the surface, the silence grew restless, demanding to be broken. Desire does not live quietly forever. He found himself drawn to her presence with a pull he could not fight. Even when he told himself to stay away, his steps carried him back to her, his excuses thin and transparent even to his own mind. She found herself anticipating his arrival, her heart betraying her before her lips could form a single word. They both lived in a state of tension, each moment filled with the possibility of collapse. And yet, despite the fear, despite the guilt that whispered in their ears, neither turned away. The silence was suffocating, but it was also intoxicating, binding them together in ways neither could escape. Late one night, when the house was quiet and the moonlight fell pale across the floor, he sat in the kitchen again, waiting. She entered, surprised to find him there, but her expression softened in the dim light. Neither spoke at first. The silence was thick, humming with all the words left unsaid. When she finally sat across from him, the air between them felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with the slightest touch. He wanted to tell her everything, to let the dam burst and drown them both, but his lips betrayed him. He spoke of nothing, of trivial things, while his eyes begged her to hear what his voice could not. She listened, nodding, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She knew the silence would not hold forever. She knew that each night they spent like this brought them closer to the moment when words would slip free, when silence would fail, and the truth would come crashing into the open. And yet she did not stop it. She let the silence stretch, let it weigh upon them both, because within it lived the only thing she could not let go of. The feeling of being wanted, seen, alive again. The weight of silence was crushing, but it was also the only place they could exist. In the shadows of unspoken words, they were free, even as the rest of the world remained blind. Still, deep within, they both knew, silence is never eternal. It always breaks. And when it does not release softly. It explodes. And so the silence continued, pressing heavier, louder, sharper with every passing day, waiting for the inevitable moment when it would fracture, and all that was hidden would come rushing to the surface. There comes a time when silence can no longer bear its own weight, when the walls built to contain a secret begin to shift and groan under pressure. Their secret had lived too long in the shadows, breathing between them, binding them in ways too visible to remain unseen forever. It began, as such things always do, not with a revelation but with suspicion. A look held too long, a presence felt too often, a pattern noticed by someone who should not have noticed. It started with glances from those closest to them, eyes lingering on details that had always gone unnoticed. Why did he come so often? Why did her smile seem brighter when he was near, softer in a way it was not with others? Small questions whispered behind closed doors, never spoken aloud at first, but growing like vines that reach for the cracks in stone. Neither of them saw it immediately. They were too lost in their own world, too consumed by the rhythm of their meetings, too blind to the fact that others had begun to see what they thought was hidden. For him, the cracks appeared in the form of questions asked casually, their weight hidden beneath a mask of curiosity. A friend teasing about how often he visited, a voice chuckling but an undertone sharp enough to make his chest tighten. He brushed it off, laughed when he needed to, but inside he felt the tremor. The secret was no longer theirs alone. It had begun to leak, to slip through the careful hands that tried to hold it still. For her, the suspicion came in subtler ways. A shift in the way her sister looked at her, the pause in conversation when she entered the room, the way her husband's eyes lingered on her face longer than before, as though searching for something beneath her expression. She told herself she imagined it, that nothing had changed, that she was only haunted by her own guilt. But guilt has a way of sharpening the senses. She noticed everything, even the silence that followed when she left a room. Silence that was no longer neutral but charged with questions unspoken. The first cracks were small, but they carried with them a fear neither could escape. He began to feel restless in her presence, torn between wanting to be close and fearing the eyes that might be watching. She began to feel the walls closing in, the freedom of their silence replaced by the suffocating weight of suspicion. The very thing that had once made their connection intoxicating, the secrecy, the danger, now threatened to destroy it. One evening, as they sat across from each other in a room dimly lit, she caught herself staring at the door, her body tense, waiting for it to open. The conversation faltered, the words between them shallow and broken. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers in a gesture meant to comfort, but even that touch carried a new weight. It was no longer just desire. It was risk. She pulled back, not because she did not want him, but because the crack in their silence had made her heart pound with something sharper than longing. Fear. Fear, however, only deepened the bond. Instead of breaking them apart, it pushed them closer, made their moments more desperate, more urgent. Every meeting felt like it could be the last. Every word spoken carried the weight of confession. He began to cling to her with a hunger that burned through caution, and she, despite her trembling, could not turn away. The cracks had begun to show, but they still convinced themselves that they could hold the wall together, that if they were careful enough, the silence could remain intact. But suspicion is a patient predator. It circles, it waits, it watches. The cracks widened slowly, pulling others into their orbit. A neighbor saw them walking too close together. A relative noticed how often he lingered by the house, how his visits stretched longer than seemed natural. Whispers grew, faint but steady, weaving their way into the fabric of daily life. She heard her name spoken softly when she entered a room. He noticed the sudden hush that followed his arrival. Both pretended not to hear, but both knew the whispers were real. The greatest crack came not from others, but from within. They began to turn on themselves, their own hearts betraying them. He would question why she grew distant at times, why her eyes darted nervously toward the door. She would wonder if his youth made him careless, if his eagerness to be near her would one day expose them both. Their silence, once a refuge, now became a prison, filled with doubts that echoed endlessly. And yet, despite the growing cracks, neither could walk away. They had stepped too far into the shadow. Desire had rooted itself too deeply. One night, she lay awake beside her husband, his steady breathing filling the room, and she felt her chest tighten with the unbearable knowledge of what she had done, what she was doing. The guilt clawed at her, whispering that the cracks would soon give way, that everything she had built could collapse in an instant. Across town, he too lay awake, his thoughts restless, torn between the thrill of what they shared and the terror of being found out. Both lived in the grip of the same fear, the same desperate need to keep the cracks from widening, but cracks once formed, never close. They spread, slow at first, then faster, until the entire structure trembles. And beneath their silence, beneath their desire, the structure of their lives was beginning to shake. They both knew it, even if they refused to speak it. The question was no longer if the secret would break free, but when. The first cracks had shown themselves. The walls of silence were no longer whole, and as suspicion grew sharper, heavier, and harder to ignore, they could both feel it. The truth waiting, pressing against the surface, demanding to be set free. There is always a moment when the silence gives way, when the cracks that seemed small and harmless spread wide enough for the truth to burst through. For them, that moment did not come gently. It arrived like a storm breaking without warning, fierce and merciless, sweeping away everything they had tried so carefully to protect. It began with suspicion sharpened into certainty. The whispers had circled too long, too persistently. A misplaced glance, a word spoken too softly, a presence too constant. Each one might have been ignored alone, but together they painted a picture too clear to deny. She had grown used to hiding behind her composure, to silencing her trembling heart with practiced smiles, but even masks begin to slip when worn too long. One evening, as she laughed at the table, her husband's eyes lingered not on her face, but on the way she looked at him, the boy who sat too close, who listened too intently, whose every movement seemed tethered to her own. It was only an instant, but in that instant everything changed. She felt it in the sudden quiet that followed, in the weight of his stare, in the air that seemed to thicken until it could not be breathed. He asked nothing at first. He only watched, the kind of watching that stripped her bare. That night, when the others had gone to sleep, his voice came low, steady, carrying the edge of steel. "Is there something you want to tell me?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her throat. She shook her head, whispered denial, but the silence that followed screamed louder than any words could. For the boy, the truth came crashing with less warning. He arrived one afternoon as he always did, light in his step, eager despite the tension that now shadowed their every meeting. But instead of her, it was her husband who greeted him. The man's expression was unreadable, his words too calm, his invitation to sit too sharp. The boy felt the trap in the air, but by then it was too late. The conversation began simple, harmless, then veered suddenly. "You seem to be around quite often," the man said, his eyes unblinking. "You must be very fond of this house." The boy tried to answer casually, but his throat tightened, his words stumbled. He saw the shift in the man's gaze, the realization hardening into certainty. It was in that moment he knew. The secret they had fought so hard to keep was no longer theirs. It was out, alive, growing with every breath they took. The confrontation came swiftly, brutally. She tried to contain it, tried to speak over the storm, but the storm was louder than her voice. Accusations flew like arrows, sharp and unrelenting. Her husband's rage was not the rage of uncertainty. It was the rage of a man betrayed, the rage of one who sees his life split open before his eyes. He demanded answers, demanded confessions, his voice shaking the walls. She denied, then faltered, then fell silent. It was her silence that damned her more than any words. For in silence, there is truth. When she finally spoke, her words came broken, fragments of a confession torn from her lips. She tried to soften it, to speak of confusion, of weakness, of mistakes that meant nothing. But nothing could soften the blow. To him, it was not a mistake. It was a wound cut deep, a betrayal that would not heal. The boy, caught in the fire of their destruction, could not look away. His chest burned with shame, with fear, with the heavy knowledge that everything he had touched had been set aflame. The truth, once revealed, spread like wildfire. Families do not keep such secrets contained. Eyes that once looked kindly now narrowed with judgment. Voices that once spoke warmly now carried only whispers laced with venom. Neighbors, relatives, friends. The world around them became a mirror reflecting back their shame. She could not step outside without feeling the weight of stares, without hearing the hush of conversations that ended when she passed. He could not walk the street without the sting of laughter behind him, laughter that was never kind. But the deepest wounds were not carved by others. They were carved in the quiet moments after the storm, when she sat alone in her room and replayed every choice she had made, when he lay awake and wondered how he could have been so reckless, so blind. The truth had shattered not only the walls around them, but the fragile bond that had once felt unbreakable. Desire had brought them together, but truth had torn them apart. Her husband's anger did not fade. It smoldered, low and relentless, turning every moment in the house into a battlefield. Words became weapons, silence became torture. She lived under his gaze, heavy with disappointment, sharp with fury. The boy was banished, his presence no longer tolerated, his name spat out like poison. Yet even as the world around them turned against them, even as the truth left ruins in its wake, the memory of what they had shared lingered, haunting them both. For the truth does not end a story. It only begins a new one. A story written not in secrecy and desire, but in consequences. And those consequences would stretch further than either of them could imagine, pulling everyone in their orbit into the ashes of what had once been. The truth had shattered. Nothing could ever be put back together in the way it was before. And as the dust settled, one question remained, pressing heavily against them all. What comes after the storm, when the truth has destroyed everything it touches? The storm had come and gone, but what it left behind did not resemble peace. The air felt heavier, as though every breath carried with it the weight of broken promises and words that could not be unsaid. Where once there had been the warmth of laughter, now silence lingered, a silence that did not comfort but condemned, one that stretched endlessly across the rooms, pressing against the walls, and creeping into the corners where memories used to hide. The ashes were not only the remains of what had burned, it was the shadow of something greater, something human that had been stripped bare. Trust, once woven delicately between hearts, had unraveled into threads too frayed to mend. Love, once unquestioned, now looked foreign and fragile, something that could no longer be held without trembling. In this quiet, choices weighed heavier than they ever had. Each face bore the mark of a decision, of an act that could not be erased. The confessions had been spoken. The betrayal had been laid bare. Now there was no shield, no illusion, no before. There was only after. Some sought to move forward to find meaning in the ruin. But moving forward did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying scars in places unseen, scars that would ache when the nights grew too long, or when a familiar voice stirred a memory. Others clung to their silence, refusing to speak because words no longer had power to rebuild. The family was no longer whole. Bonds had fractured. Loyalties had been tested and found wanting. The dream of what they once were could not be resurrected. Yet among the wreckage, there was still a flicker, small, faint, but real, that survival was possible. That even in the ashes, something might yet grow. Not the same as before, never the same, but something. Because after all the storms and betrayals, after all the nights that broke them apart, there was no returning to the way it had been, only the choice to carry the burden forward or to lay it down and walk into the unknown with nothing but the echoes of what was lost. And so, the silence remained, not an ending, but a reminder. The ashes did not speak, but they remembered.